There's Mark. There's us.
Yeah.
Wait. I'll go to this feed too.
Right.
Can you hear me?
Begin here. So hello, audience here at Pace University, the Pleasantville campus and the ever-morphing Pleasantville campus. And we're going to have a discussion of paths to eliminate carbon from New York State's energy diet. How would you get that done in the world we know? We have very special contact here today with Mark Jacobson, who is visiting. Mark, are you are you in the Bay Area? Are you online yet? Can you hear me? Actually.
Yes, I'm at Stanford. Can you hear me?
Yeah. So he's Mark's in Palo Alto, and you'll learn more about him in a second. And to my right here is Karl Rábago. Rábago, who is the now almost for a year has been the head of the Pace Energy and Climate Center at the law school. And as I wrote on .earth the other day, he's been involved in every facet of the industry and policy world that's related to getting electricity to people. I think that's fair to say. Is there any facet you've not been involved in?
No, I've done looking.
Right, he's been a regulator, he's been a utility executive, he's been a renewable energy consultant and law professor. Yeah. Have you taught law about this?
I've taught law about at University of Houston, and actually I started at West Point. That's when I came to Pace first as a student to study environmental law.
So he's invaluable. Mark Jacobson is invaluable because for years now he's been doing studies. He's a professor of engineering at Stanford in a couple of institutes there. And Mark, correct me if I get anything wrong, but basically he's been really focused now for at least, well, I don't know, when did you start doing these menus for fossil-free energy supplies? He's done this at the global scale, at the United States scale, and at the state-by-state scale, and now solutions.
The first plan we developed was 2009. It was kind of a world plan and Scientific American, but it took years before that to actually get all the information you needed for these plans.
So I thought we'd very briefly start at that global scale because greenhouse gases don't care where they come from. I mean, the atmosphere is a globally mixed fluid, essentially, and CO2 coming from a power plant in China or from a taxi cab in Westchester doesn't matter to the climate system. In the end, we're forcing the climate system globally. That's what makes it so different than traditional pollution issues, which mostly were local, and even those have become global, like the soot from Chinese power plants was coming across the Pacific. So it's all becoming global, but nothing is as global as climate, the climate question. So at that scale, Mark, what do you foresee? Just quickly, because we really are going to focus on local action. What were your main lessons that came away from your analysis?
Well, I mean, I looked at it from climate and air pollution point of view, and the climate problems associated with fossil fuels, both the greenhouse gases and the particulate soot, really black carbon and brown carbon, dark particles in the air, are really serious problems. It's actually more serious than most people think because greenhouse gases actually are causing about twice as much warming in the atmosphere as we actually see or realize from temperature measurements. And black carbon contributes to about 20% of the total warming that's occurring. But there are other types of particles, pollution particles, that are reflective, that are light-colored, mostly from sulfates and nitrates that are not from the same sources necessarily as black carbon, and ammonium and water that reflect and offset about half of global warming. So half of global warming is being masked or hidden by these cooling particles. And both the warming particles, the black carbon and brown carbon, and the cooling particles cause health problems. They kill up to between 4 and 7 million people worldwide prematurely each year. So you want to clean them up, but as you clean up all the particles, you'll reduce mostly cooling particles because there are more of them, and that will actually unmask more warming. So the problem is much more serious than most people think, the problem of global warming.
And then, of course, we've had the quote-unquote pause. This global warming is on a long time scale, and the weather has lots of variability at different time scales, and so politically, there's been this, hey, well, where's your warming lately meme? And there is some validity to the fact that we've been in a short-term slowdown in warming, but that's another kind of reality on a human time scale, where politics makes decisions or not decisions. you've had to deal with that as well. So it's kind of a messy system. And by the way, you raised that really important paradox as China and India shift toward cleaning up their conventional pollution, but you'll have more warming as a result. So it's that's really a tough challenge. And that's what gets things kind of shifting toward, I think, the local or national scale. You know, there's not much we can do here to except produce better technology that can be sold to China to help them transition to cleaner energy. And so this comes back to our own borders. And then, so you did the national analysis first and then state by state?
Yes, well, we did a world one, then we did a United States kind of national analysis, but it wasn't very detailed. Then we went into state by states. We did a New York state, actually developed a plan for that. It's the first state. And then we did a California plan and a Washington state plan. But then we decided, okay, let's just do all 50 states. It's a lot easier actually to do all of them together. And we've finished a 50 state plan, or almost finished a 50 state plan for each of the states. And then we've actually moved on to develop 139 country plans, or almost finished with those, for the rest of the world, although that's not the whole rest of the world yet. But yeah.
Sorry, and by the way, they're all at, is it thesolutionsproject.net, or is it?
Or, yeah, so there's so the group, so we've been doing most of the research at Stanford, and some other universities, including Cornell, have been contributing, and UC Davis. But we've started an NGO called the Solutions Project started with Mark Ruffalo and Marco Cripples and Josh Fox and myself, and now there's several other people involved. And this is a nonprofit to try to take these plans and educate the public and policymakers about them and business people about them, and maybe try to get them implemented through by educating people about them and hopefully allowing policymakers to make better decisions.
Yeah, some people might chuckle at people like Mark being involved, the Hulk major actor, but he has been, and I wrote about this on fracking, for example. He's been a very influential factor in getting public attention to complicated issues, especially energy issues. Karl and I and you live in this wonky world that it's hard to make it sort of resonate with the average person, where you just plug your thing into the wall and recharge it and you're done. So having people like that involved, I think, is useful. I assume you think so.
Oh, definitely. I mean, well, Mark is very passionate about everything he does, and it's just amazing because, yeah, as a scientist, nobody listens to us. I mean, we publish things and put them in esoteric journals, and then it kind of gets lost after a few days. And so it's great when we have people who are good voices to actually get the information out and broadcast it to a wider audience.
So let's take this to the state level. We're getting toward where Karl comes in. And one thing that people should know about the analysis you've been doing, this is the whole schmear. This is transport and heating and cooling and all energy, not just the grid, right?
Yeah, so it's electricity, transportation, heating, cooling, and industry. So it pretty much covers all energy sectors. And it's complete conversion to electricity, and including some hydrogen that's produced from electricity. But yeah, it's electrifying basically everything, all sectors, eliminating all air pollution, eliminating global warming emissions, and creating jobs and trying to stabilize prices because you have zero fuel costs of wind, water, and solar. So wind, water, and solar are powering all the electricity. So
they're really about the upfront cost and the other kinds of hurdles toward getting something installed that's new.
Yeah, these renewables, wind, water, solar energy technologies have higher capital costs, but zero fuel costs. So when you look at the amortized costs over time, they're either similar or actually better now in case of wind, and even utility scale solar is competitive now. But yeah, the upfront costs are a challenge.
So this is where I want to bring Karl into the discussion, because in relation to the grid is this, again, thing that most people don't really think about until it doesn't work, or the distribution system goes dark because of transmission and distribution, or how we get electricity from places that generate it. The grid is something that had grown up since the days of Edison, 100 plus years ago, into this. New York State is trying to figure out right now. It's a pretty arcane, inefficient, funky system. So how do you make that more plug and play for these new technologies? Karl, can you just sort of give people a quick sketch of this thing we call the grid, and then we can talk about how to change it?
Yeah, and actually, if you think about it, it's while us wonks see the grid as being arcane, and the word Amory Lovins likes to use is brittle, which I think is a really good description of it because it's like a giant crystal chandelier. It's subject to being broken in one little place, and it'll all kind of, shatter into bits. All of that necessitated by the scale and the basic engineering structures behind it. We are living the legacy of a system that took about almost 100 years to build. And now we're stuck with it, but the electric utility sector is the most capital-intense industry sector in the world. So just think about all those bankers, and all those bonds and all that stock and the momentum that has. Now, to be fair, electricity is also one of the most versatile energy carriers that we have. I mean, even at the prices you pay here, if you had to get it from oil, it would be like getting oil at over $200 a barrel, right? And right now we think, oil at $100 a barrel is not too far in the past and probably not too far in the future again. But it's electricity in just a basic energy sense is worth $200 a barrel or more, and we spend that for it because the energy you get with electricity is so versatile. It can do so many things in so many different ways. So it's useful having. But back to that 100-year arc. Once upon a time, and this is where it gets kind of nerdy because you have to understand some basic economics, but I think everybody does. Once upon a time, the bigger you built the power plant, the cheaper it got. So these were days long before I was a regulator, but old regulators speak wistfully of the times when all they had to do is approve of the utility's construction of a new power plant, and they could lower rates for everyone. And the ultimate manifestation of that dream was going to be nuclear power, right? And we just bigger those things right on up. And there were actual serious people who used to say that it would be so big that electricity, and so cheap that electricity would be too cheap to meter. And nuclear power was going to carry us to that wonderful day. It turns out that those economies of plant scale really didn't bear out toward that wondrous infinity. And in fact, they started declining pretty rapidly, starting even in the 1950s, and certainly as we tried building all those nuclear power plants, because they just became way too big. A little point, when I was sitting on the Texas Commission, we had to put Comanche Peak into rates, meaning that we had to preside over the case and make the decision that that nuclear power plant would be allowed to operate and that the utility would collect charges from the customers, just like Indian Point here in our neighborhood and many other power plants in other places. That power plant was approved at $750 million, and it ultimately went into rates at $12.4 billion, a 17 times cost multiplier. And that's typical in the nuclear power era. So big plants didn't work, but we still have them. They didn't continue to they did work, but they don't work anymore, I should say. It doesn't make sense to build big plants anymore. Nobody's proposing to build big plants anymore, except in very socialist countries, or like the state of Georgia, which is the same thing. Sorry. I just can't believe they're still trying to build a nuke down there. And in several other places in the country. It's crazy. But at any rate, and Florida, no, they gave that one up on Florida. So what is it that characterizes it? Giant power plants with giant transmission lines carrying it down to skinnier and skinnier lines to finally get to extremely small uses of electricity that you will see sort of on the wall. That's the residential, commercial way we use electricity. And when I say extremely small, we're talking about a couple of orders of magnitude. You build a power plant in the old Central Station power plant in the 1,000 megawatt scale, and we use electricity to recharge our phones in the 5 watt scale. So 2 1,000s down, megawatts, kilowatts, watts, to get to the useful energy. And that means a lot of spillage. It means a lot of brittle architecture. It means people joke that you could use with 6 or 10 well-placed bullets, you could bring down the entire US grid, because it's so dependent on all that big machine working. And the last thing I'll say before we move on is that it's also been generally thought of as a one-way electron delivery system. And that's the biggest change that's in front of us now. The idea that it's not just big plants making electrons, if you will, electricity, and shoving it down those smaller and smaller pipes for customers to use. What has happened most dramatically in the last 2 decades is that it is becoming increasingly possible for us to be the power plants, for us to be the regulators of energy availability, to have storage, like my Bolt parked out in the lot, sitting right there in my house, and then to be able to be tapped at any given time. All that dumb one-way electron delivery system is turning into a smart 2-way, 3-way, multiple-way web, and that's what makes these kinds of transitions possible. So,
actually, I want to give you the floor for another couple of minutes because it's important to then ask: is our grid smart enough to handle that? And if not, what does it need? And this relates to the things that Mark's proposals would need to plug into that grid. So, can you give a quick sense of what's going on with Rev, and just for those who are not familiar with it, say what we're trying to do? There is a question on Dagworth related to this.
Good. Yeah. So, in this process of changing from this dumb one-way delivery system and this large central station dominated model, everybody realizes we've exhausted the economics of that, and everybody realizes it needs to change. Now, that everybody is a US-centric view. There are still countries trying to get basic electricity going, and some of them are rebuilding our mistakes, and some are trying to leapfrog our mistakes to a new decentralized model. We can leave that world behind. But all that inertia, all that momentum that I talked about, all that capital that's invested in the old central station plant with the big power lines needs to be turned. And the work of that is done in regulators. Utilities are a weird thing, generally speaking. They enjoy a monopoly. And we're supposed to be the largest free market capitalistic society in the world. A democracy that runs on capitalism or vice versa. And we grant the biggest industry a monopoly. So it's kind of weird to do that. The consequences of that were, in the old days, we got a lot of infrastructure built, and that big, wonderful electric system was constructed. And monopoly shareholders got pretty wealthy, or at least consistently got good returns on their investment. And utility companies deployed all that capital that I talked about. But it came with other things. They tend to stagnate when it comes to innovation because they're protecting their old investments instead of considering the new ones. They tend to offer you one-size-fits-all kinds of solutions. They tend to think of you as a consumer. Actually, they don't even call them consumers or customers. They call them rate payers because individuals have that function of just paying the rate for the electricity that's made for them. And we've got to change that. So here in New York and in several places around the country, the leading states, California, maybe Minnesota, could be one of these, regulatory people who oversee the monopoly have basically come to the conclusion there must be another way. We've got to figure out some way to break the back of this old model, and maybe we can use this distributed energy, the distributed energy resources of us, like I said before, managing our electricity better, deploying storage into our garages and homes, putting solar on our rooftops, putting small combined heat and power systems in commercial centers, doing all this stuff at the skinny end of the system. Maybe that can be the thing that drives the fundamental change we need. So, New York, REV, reforming the energy vision, announced by the governor about a year ago and being led by Chairwoman Audrey Zibelman, is the thing to watch in what's going on in the electricity world. And its focus is on what they call animating the distributed markets. That's where the action is.
So this leads me back to Mark. One of your studies, it was the New York study, in charting what would be needed to be fossil-free by 2030. You had this pretty impressive list of the things that you want, and they're on that Solutions Project website when you click on the map for New York. 4,020 onshore 5 megawatt wind turbines, 12,000 and change offshore 5 megawatt turbines, 500,000 100 kilowatt commercial government rooftop photovoltaic installations, and the list goes on. It's a lot of stuff. Now, I'm curious if on the state-by-state analysis, you or others are now building from what you found to what you would need in the regulatory and administrative and bureaucratic arena to make it feasible. What are the things that could help facilitate that scale of build-out?
Well, so the New York study we did based on, well, how many devices we need. We first took the current energy demand, or what's called load, in all sectors, electricity, transportation, heating, cooling, and industry, and we projected that forward to 2050, and also we did in 2030 as well. And we then looked at, well, if we converted everything, what would be the equivalent amount of electricity we need? And so the first interesting thing that we found this on the world scale too, is that you actually reduce your power demand significantly by electrifying everything, because just electricity is more efficient than internal combustion. You can see this most effectively in transportation, because like a plug-to-wheel efficiency of an electric car is about 80 to 86%. In other words, 80 to 86% of the electricity going into the car goes to move the car. Rest is waste heat. Whereas a gasoline car, only 17 to 20% of the energy in gasoline goes to move a car. The rest is waste heat. So you actually reduce your power demand significantly by electrifying things. So we found there's a reduction of power demand that way. Then you can have end-use energy efficiency improvements, which could be up to 25%, but we were very conservative and assumed only about 6% reduction of energy due to energy efficiency improvements. But then we said, okay, well, how many devices do we need to power this remaining demand? And so we came up, well, from the New York paper, we had a certain number. We've actually since then updated it, and based on more information, and the numbers are actually a little bit lower, especially in the solar areas. But then, okay, so then we've done this for all 50 states, but then the next question is, well, can we actually keep the grid reliable? Because even though that, in the annual average, that can power all the U.S. in this case, because we aggregate all 50 states, we can power the whole U.S., that doesn't necessarily mean the power is coming at the exact right time. So we've subsequently, and this hasn't been published yet, but we're submitting it really soon, we subsequently did a whole grid integration study for the entire U.S., looking at 2050 for all 50 states. Can we actually, if we add certain amounts of storage, of low-cost storage, by the way, so no batteries, in fact, which are the most expensive type of storage, and we actually break the loads into heating loads and cooling loads, which you will actually have, even though they're electrified, you still have, even though we're electrifying everything, there's actually certain loads that are just for heating and cooling that we don't need to store in batteries. We can just store heat and cold. And same thing in industry for high temperature processes. Well, we found that we can actually include storage and actually power the entire grid of the U.S. if it were aggregated at pretty low cost. But it would require, so in addition to the devices that we proposed in, for example, the New York plan and each of the other states, we would need slightly more power, about 10 to 15%, to try to match the grid, plus a bunch of storage that's all low cost, like soil storage, water storage, storage of heat and water and cold and water and in ice, and then in the case of southern states, in concentrated solar power plants with storage, and then also existing and planned pumped hydro is a form of storage, hydroelectric power, which is really one-way storage because you can't really replenish it except for natural rainfall, but you can use the power whenever you want. So when you combine different types of storage that either are currently available or that are existing but have to be implemented on a large scale, you can actually get power pretty not too much more expensively than if you just look at the generators alone. But it does require, and the other thing that you can use is what's called demand response management. So really to make the grid stable with a wind, water, solar system, you need the energy generators, you need certain types of low-cost storage, you need to have a system of what's called demand response where the utilities give incentives to people not to use energy at certain times. And the fact that you have hydrogen is another type of storage because you're using hydrogen for some forms of energy like transportation or industry, and you can, whenever you have too much wind or too much solar, instead of just dumping it, which is currently done quite a bit, you can actually then use that extra electricity to produce hydrogen and store it to when you need it. So when you combine all these things together, it turns out you can actually get a stable grid. We found that there's zero loss of load over a 6-year period. And the standard industry standard is a loss of load of 1 day in 10 years. So we do think it's possible to do.
Yeah, so you can really imagine the technical sort of orchestration that's required. So remember the old system, it required you to make power, get it down those lines, and they do have to keep the entire system in balance. But now if every one of you is a player, if every one of you is a potential generator or can adjust your consumption, then the grid operator becomes much more of an orchestra conductor, right? And you're not at the house right now, we can turn your thermostat down a little bit. You've got guests, we can turn your thermostat up a little bit, and we can actually arrange a transaction between the two of you. If you've got an electric vehicle in your car, you don't need that electricity, maybe you can buy it. As opposed to the old system where the utility sat back and said, you're not buying as much, you need to buy more, and it did just one-way transactions between us. So the internet has to come to the electric grid, but that wonderful opportunity of not just making more electricity for you and thinking I'm going to make more electricity for you, but instead delicately balancing the system is the real opportunity. So study that internet and communications stuff as well as the electrical stuff in order to figure out the technological revolution.
And for young people, again, this means that I think in the old days you thought of the utilities and electricity as engineers, a mechanical, electrical engineering arena, but it's a computer, it's a programming arena, it's a app arena, it's all of those things, very entrepreneurial possibilities.
And huge sociological implications, right? How do I get you to actually consciously think, if I'm not at home, maybe I can engage in a transaction in which I sell my excess demand for electricity or that electricity? How do I stimulate that to rise on your list of priorities, given that you have 45 other things you're trying to figure out what to do every single day? And what kind of service providers might be able to reach you? What kind of marketing and advertising is going to get you to say, hey, wow, I think I'm going to play along with that opportunity. I'm going to turn my car into a little bit of a revenue generator, because the first thing I'm going to do is get it off of petroleum, and the second thing I'm going to do is syndicate it to somebody who's selling electricity to people who tend to have parties a lot.
By the way, I'm going to start to, if you have questions, start to think about your question and get ready to go to the microphone here in the room. Same goes for anyone watching online. Tweet to Energy Desk, so the hashtag Energy Desk, and we'll see your questions come up.
Energy Pace.
Oh, sorry, Energy. I was thinking of Earth Desk, our blog. No, yeah, Energy Pace. Thank you. Now, some of these things exist. Demand management, which Mark mentioned in California, at least. I don't know where else is already out there.
When I ran distributed energy services at Austin Energy, the municipal utility in Austin. I had 1 out of 4 residential air conditioners under my control, actually under my staff's control. So when we had a peak event come up where the demand for electricity was getting really, really high and the cost was getting really, really high, we could turn off 90,000 air conditioners for 20 minutes at a time and reduce our peak in our system by 25 megawatts on a multi-hour basis, or 100 megawatts all at once. And customers barely noticed. There's a little radio device built into their thermostat. It knocked them off for 20 minutes, and they'd ride through. They wouldn't even notice that the air conditioner just didn't come on that 20 minutes, but we saved a lot of money doing that. Imagine what you could do, again, I keep pointing at you, you're going to get this electric car. But imagine what you could do is if you also had the option of, instead of just cutting down that air conditioner, say you may not want to do that with with a retirement home or something. Well, maybe what you can do is tap into those vehicles and take that electricity instead of buying from the grid. So demand response can work with storage, and then by the way, if you put some solar on your roof, then at noon you can fill up your car with sunshine, and you can have a party in the evening later on with sun power. Right?
So Mark, this gets back to what I was asking earlier about, has anyone else, or is anyone at Stanford or Freeport using the menus you created to start to figure out what states are missing the policy components that could help facilitate that kind of shift?
Yeah, well, it's interesting because, this all depends on policies being implemented. So, we're developing these theoretical plans that and people have to want to do it to actually get it implemented. They have to talk to their policymakers. I mean, we've engaged with policymakers primarily in New York, in California, and a little bit in Washington State so far. But I mean, we've talked with some policymakers in many different states, including Oregon even, and we've had some traction. But we haven't really navigated the policy world so significantly that we know that yet at this point. Although that's kind of hopefully coming up.
So it sounds like a good opportunity. Maybe some of our energy and climate people and policy people can.
Yeah, we're welcoming all the assistance we can get.
And also, by the way, I got to tell you the story that Karl just told me is a story I hadn't heard about the air conditioner option there. And boy, I'd love to write about that. Has it been written up that exists?
I think we could find some of that work. I mean, Austin was a special kind of community. Over 25 years ago, they decided that they were going to get really serious about this stuff. It's become cultural in Austin. Now, we were talking before the program started that I worry a little because the city is now getting up to 1 million people pretty solid, and it's hard to maintain that community culture. It's still alive and well in neighborhoods, but it's really hard to do it on a full city. But you know, the proof is pretty good. I mean, and one of the things Mark was saying, you know, about how we can actually save money and use less energy. The Austin numbers bear that out. After those 25 years of concerted effort to conserve energy instead of to generate energy, when I was there a few years ago, they were able to reject an invitation to join in the expansion of the nuke because they didn't need it. The average residential electric bill in Austin was 20% lower than the average residential bill in the state of Texas. Yeah, and those are two separate places. It's sort of. The visual is a blueberry floating in a very big bowl of tomato soup. Okay, so you can just take that one. But they had paid for all their smart meters with cash. They had not financed a power plant in many years. The average air conditioner in Austin was more efficient because of these concerted programs. So, I mean, you can make a difference. It can take a while, but you can make a difference by changing the culture of your community, and you can save a ton of money going with cleaner options.
Mark, there is a tweet here that came in with it's a pretty micro question from Bert Bland. He says deep geothermal is in the New York State paper as a 5% contributor, but the icons on Solutions Project show 0. It might just be
Oh, yeah. Actually, well, since the paper, which has been a couple of years now, and even 3 or 4 years when we started, we've actually updated things, looking in more detail at geothermal resources, for example, in New York State and several other states, and really determined that there are actually really maybe 13 states in the U.S. where there's really strong, reasonable geothermal resources, but New York is not necessarily one of them. Even though there's a lot of geothermal, it's just to get really, it'd be pretty expensive. It's going to be a longer haul to actually get geothermal in New York. So we took that out because it wasn't necessary. There were other ways we could make up that energy. And the same thing with concentrated solar power. New York's not great for concentrated solar power, which is you need really focused light from the sun, but as opposed to you have really good photovoltaic resources. So we just increased photovoltaic resources and reduced concentrated solar power resources.
And what Mark was saying was pretty important. Just a short technical note on geothermal, right? Power plant type geothermal is drilling a long, deep hole to get to hot rock down below or steam down below, maybe miles deep, and then tapping that with a piping system to have the steam come up or do a heat exchange thing. It's really good in places like Indonesia, along the Pacific coast, in Japan, the Ring of Fire, where that hot rock is closer to the surface. But you should not ignore the fact that the ground stays at a pretty constant temperature, just a few feet below the surface. And it's always a bit different from what you want in your house. So when it's, there's some heat down there, even in the wintertime, if it's at 56 degrees, and there's some cooling down there in the summertime, if it's always about 56 degrees. And you can use technology even at the household level that some people also call geothermal. Same with the solar. Concentrated solar may not be right here, but rooftop photovoltaics with silicon are a great deal here in the state of New York.
So, and this, I guess this circles back to this question I'm going to keep asking, which is, it's about how do you get traction on these things. Upfront cost on geothermal for me was prohibitive when we lived in a house with 3 acres, and we could actually have done the shallow geothermal. And, but there are these models that are expanding for, well, certainly for solar installations, where you're not doing the upfront cost, where it's more of like a chunk of the utility is on your roof, and and then there's Mosaic. I noticed Billy Parrish is one of the partners in Mark's solutions project. Billy Parrish is someone I met when he was the age of a number of the students in the audience here. He was this kid in Montreal at the climate talks, an activist, energy action, trying that approach, and then that kind of, he realized that he couldn't spend his life doing that. So now he's an entrepreneur. He came up with this solar Mosaic model for a business where the upfront financing for solar installations for nonprofits, like for on top of the rooftop of a building in Oakland, California, small investors, basically me or you, can put in money into an interest-bearing account that gives the capital for them to do that stuff. It's brilliant, but it's hampered by arcane finance laws about who's a large investor or small investor. There's these weird roadblocks to more people participating in that. So this gets to the arena that, again, the business school at Pace or at any other place, Stanford, also has to play a role in coming in. A lot of the innovations we need are not like a better microchip or better solar photovoltaic system. They're better financial models.
We definitely need financial innovation and economic innovation. One of the important things to remember, when I started off, I told you that the electric utility industry used to run on economies of plant scale. It's shifting to technologies that run on economies of manufacturing scale. Like computers, the more you make, the cheaper they get, right? So we need to drive volume for these technologies like rooftop solar or electronic system controllers or electric vehicle batteries or electric vehicle systems and all this stuff, because we can drive the cost down. Meanwhile, and Mark said this right up front, I think he mentioned the fact that you don't have a fuel cost with a lot of the solar, wind, other renewable resources. So there's no fuel cost on efficiency. In fact, you save fuel, right? You save emissions, and you save all that system inefficiency when you conserve or use energy more efficiently. But that does pose this financial problem. When you buy your solar panel, you're paying for 30 years worth of work and 30 years worth of, if you will, fuel right up front. So it makes it hard for low-income customers or students or people on fixed income to participate in that kind of activity. Lease companies that come into place, but there's some states where you can't even get a lease system on your roof. They're a little more expensive than buying it outright, but for some people they're the only solution because there's no money down. So we need innovation in that, and we need regulators and policymakers to allow those businesses to operate. You may have heard Tesla's in a battle now in several states because of archaic auto dealership laws that say you can't sell a car in the state unless you have a dealership. Tesla wants to sell electric vehicles and not have the overhead of dealerships. And, it's like that's kind of where a lot of things are going. But there's some old-fashioned laws that are stopping them in many states, and they're having to go state by state to have this battle, just like Solar City and other solar companies have to go state by state to battle for the opportunity to work for you.
So Mark, I'm sure you get feedback of this sort all the time. You lay out the menu and then people say yes, but. So where do you go with that?
Well, the biggest issue that most people have had, especially utilities, is they say, yeah, this sounds great, but how are you going to keep the lights on? They say wind doesn't always blow, the sun doesn't always shine. This whole system is going to fail because of the intermittency of wind and solar. So that's what led us to this grid integration study, which we can now, at least that's the first step in trying to show that it's not going to fail. And there are a lot of other studies that have tried large penetrations of renewables on their system, and there are in fact even places, even South Dakota and Iowa have almost 30% wind on their grid, and the lights are staying on. So we're seeing more and more that you can push the limits, not only in reality. In Denmark, sometimes you get up to 70% energy is wind, and in Germany you have a lot as well. So we're seeing in reality that we can push the limits of the grid, but also theoretically from modeling we can find that we can do a lot more to get closer to 100%. So that's one thing. The other thing that people complain about is the high capital cost. I mean, worldwide it would cost, if we just add up all the generators we need to power the entire world with wind, water, and solar, without considering all the rest, it's about $100 trillion, which sounds like a lot. It is, but the fossil fuel industry spends, I think it's somewhere between 5 and 7 trillion a year, and so so the payback time on that is it's on the order of between 10 and 20 years, so it's not that bad. But again, though, when you amortize the cost, when you actually look at the cost of electricity, I mean, wind is right now, so when you count for the capital cost plus the fuel cost, which is zero for renewables, plus the operation cost, and then at the end of the life you have to decommission, you look at that and spread that out over time, the cost of wind right now is the cheapest form of electric power in the United States on average. The unsubsidized cost is 3.7 cents per kilowatt hour. The subsidized cost is about 2.2 from power purchase agreements in the Great Plains areas mostly. And that compares with natural gas, which is 6 to 8 cents a kilowatt hour. This is the levelized cost of energy. This is not the price you're paying. Of course, in New York, the price of energy is I think it's like 18 cents a kilowatt hour, but the actual levelized cost of energy for natural gas is 6 to 8. So it's twice the cost of wind on average in the U.S. Utility scale solar in the U.S. on average is also around 6 to 8 cents per kilowatt hour, but residential is like 2 to 3 times higher than that. So we've seen that when you actually look at the costs for especially wind and onshore wind, that is, offshore is actually much more expensive right now because there is none. But in utility scale solar, those are less expensive. Intermittency is grid operators think it's a problem, but they actually haven't proven it's a problem. And more, I think we're dispelling that myth. And then, then you can get into esoteric things like, a big one is that I always hear is, well, wind turbines kill birds, so, and this is obviously an issue and people are sensitive to it. But when you put it in context, you realize, well, actually natural gas kills 10 times more birds per kilowatt hour generated than wind does in the United States due to the mining of the destruction of the habitat on the ground during mining, the air pollution as well that kills birds, and also the buildings which kill birds. So it's 10 times per kilowatt hour, same as coal. Anyway, so each of these myths can be dispelled in different ways.
And free-range cats kill birds.
Cats kill. Actually, an interesting statistic. In the United States, the Bird Conservancy, American Bird Conservancy, they estimate 80 million birds are killed by cats per year. Wind turbines, they estimate 400,000 to 440,000. So it's totally out of proportion.
So we have questions both Twitter and live in person. Charlene Hogler from the science staff here has a question, and then I'm going to go to Twitter.
This is for both gentlemen.
Get closer. Just come a little closer to the microphone because he's got him set real close.
Okay. May I have your thoughts, both Mark and Karl, about two things. One is methane recapture and reuse, and the second is the technology dealing with garbage to energy conversion.
So waste to energy and methane capture from
methane from where?
Like landfills?
There's methane from waste
okay,
materials
sure.
like
Yeah.
kilns, or there's
The
also methane from
RCRA
fracking.
Subpart B regulations. So, yeah, it's for one of the things that's really important about methane, and this is just in general, right, is everybody should know that it's 20 or so times more powerful as a greenhouse gas than carbon dioxide. So if you have a bottle of methane, you'd much rather burn it for the atmosphere than release it, which is a really big issue on this fracking and drilling and pipelines, because we lose about 4% of methane in these operations, and some people think the numbers could even be higher around some of these fracking and other operations, which means it's like 20 times that volume of carbon dioxide going to the air. And also, as we warm the planet, there's significant concern that we are releasing methane hydrates from deep oceans and methane that's sequestered in permafrost and stuff. So everybody needs to understand that silly little molecule, that CH4, is real trouble. it is the natural product of decomposition of organic matter, right? So something, anything organic being carbon-based, it's going to turn into, through anaerobic digestion, it's going to turn into methane. It's why sewage treatment plants sometimes stink, unless they put a cap on them. And it's why if you actually ever dug up anything that was rotting in the ground, you'd notice it stinks too. There's hydrogen sulfide and methane in that. For many years, we have required large-scale landfills to collect their methane, and with a system of pipes. Basically, you put a bladder on top and you put a seal at the bottom, and it becomes a little reactor. That's the term they actually use, and it makes methane, and you can make very useful electricity with it. So, and right there, usually at the site. So it's a really good idea. In terms of reuse there is still the priority, right? Reduce, reuse, and recycle. And using organic matter to make methane is kind of the last thing you would do with it if you couldn't find something else to do with it better. But there's a contest between, for example, composting, which might be done in the open and release that methane, versus putting it into a collection facility where you can collect it and burn it. But we don't want methane out into the environment. If we can at all do it, it's useful energy, we should use it.
Can I just make a statement about the methane number you used? There's a more updated 86 times. Is
86 times?
By the
Okay.
Intergovernmental Panel.
All right.
Well, it depends on the span of time.
Right, over 20 years,
Right.
which is what if we probably only have 20 years.
Okay, so it's even worse. So it's almost 100-time reason to not let
based on
methane
that,
leak. Yeah.
Can I,
We can do a whole other hour on that.
Oh, yeah, that question.
Can I ask a question
Say who you are.
about my name is Susan Van Dolson. I live in Harrison. I'm a community member. And would like to ask with the electric generation, obviously that's the focus of what we're talking about is doing more electricity. And I know they're still permitting quite a few gas-fired power plants in the state and pipelines and all of that. And if we're trying to get away from fossil fuels, and we're talking about this methane problem, and we clearly, wind, water, and solar is what Mark Jacobson's talking about. Why is New York State in the Rev and all of this still talking about, smaller gas-fired plants all through New England? They've got this whole network they want to build, from the new pipelines, and they're going to, just to me, I don't understand what that purpose of doing all of that is, and where gas fits into this whole picture.
I assume, Mark, do you want to weigh in on that a little bit? And then Karl, maybe? There's some particular reason.
Yeah, maybe Karl can answer about the New York situation in terms of why natural gas is being used.
Well, the relatively low current price of natural gas as a fuel is driving, and the relatively low cost of natural gas burning engines and combined cycle generators and stuff is got the people in the power plant business choosing those alternatives. And they win in competitive solicitations. A lot of policymakers think that these gas-powered power plants are a good bridge transition, lower carbon, lower emissions bridge transition to the wind, water, solar kind of future. But they say, we need electricity now, we don't want to slow down economic growth, and we don't want to wait for all that stuff to become affordable. I have argued that what I think we need to do right now is kind of what New York is doing, which is saying, yes, they're going through the process of looking at those power plants, they're letting them be sited because there is demand for electricity, but they're initiating this separate process of the REV to boost up those markets and not just wait for them to happen. That's the critical policy step now, is that you just can't blithely let the market do what the market does, because it was set up to do the old stuff. It wasn't set up to do the new stuff. And it takes an actual intervention like this REV proceeding to make it turn direction.
Actually, there's one more natural gas question that came in on Twitter before we get to the next audience question. Steve Kent, who I know for a long time works on environmental issues, said, he asked, the Jacobson et al. New York State plant saw no role for natural gas, which obviously, if you want a fossil-free future, that's right. But he asks if your New York State plant should consider renewable natural gas. This is basically biogas. Why not include that if you're, well, anyway, pretty.
Yeah. So yeah, our position on gas, well, so definitely we don't want to mine any new gas, but if there's gas, like in the example of, already leaking from like a landfill or something, capturing it, but we would go further than saying we could use that for electricity generation, because we wouldn't want to combust it, because we're looking at it from an air pollution and a climate point of view. So we don't want to burn things, because burning is the worst thing you can do to create pollution. But you can use gas like that would leak anyway in a fuel cell, and it's a chemical process that minimizes any emissions of air pollutants. So it does produce CO2, because all methane has to go to CO2 and water eventually, but it goes pretty much straight to CO2, so you don't get any of the other byproducts of combustion. And so a fuel cell could be in a vehicle or some other thing. Probably not stationary electricity, because it's not very efficient, although maybe you could use it. It's not like you can't use it, but it's not the most efficient use of that. So methane, the only use of methane we would see is in some chemical process that does not produce the products of combustion. But that would be in a 2050 world of wind, water, solar.
This raises the kind of really tough decisions we have to make in this transition too, because I actually, one of the things I got to do years ago was run a fuel cell lab where we bought and ran fuel cells until they broke to figure out what broke them. Fuel cells ultimately combine hydrogen and oxygen, and you know from your high school chemistry class, if you just put those two together, they'll explode. So it's kind of a controlled dating environment inside a fuel cell where you put hydrogen and oxygen, and all they do, they have a membrane between them, they exchange electrons in a non-combustive environment. So it's nicer. But you still do get the CO2. And even fuel cells that run on methane have to take that carbon plus hydrogen and break it into hydrogen and oxygen with CO2 in order to feed the fuel cell. So there's a debate out there. A lot of the methane or a lot of the hydrogen could be coming from drilling, or even pure hydrogen. A lot of it comes from reforming natural gas. Some people said we shouldn't have fuel cells because it just encourages the market for natural gas. But if we didn't have fuel for fuel cells, then we might not get the fuel cell industry going. So sorting through those chicken and egg kind of problems is a real challenge in energy policy.
So another live question, and then one from Twitter, and then another live.
Right. My question is for Professor Jacobson. How important is utility scale renewable to meet our climate change objectives? Governor Cuomo just recently rejected an offshore wind farm off the coast of Long Island, citing that it would cost too much money. It was about $1 billion project. How much of a setback is that for us?
Yeah, well, I think that's very short-sighted, because we have so much energy available offshore the East Coast and the entire U.S. I mean, you can power virtually the whole U.S. if you can connect it with offshore wind. So that's very short-sighted. And so, but in New York, I mean, if we wanted to cover virtually every rooftop, well, first of all, if we convert all the sectors to electricity, and then we covered virtually every rooftop that's existing, that's south-facing, not shaded, we could only really power about 7% of New York State with that energy. So you can't just do it with rooftop solar. I mean, you want to do as much as you can, and even do more, put it over highways even, get even more out of it. But you do need utility scale, both wind and solar. And especially, solar you can do distributed, you can put in cities, but it's more difficult to put wind in cities, maybe on the top of skyscrapers, but winds are usually slower in cities because you have so much friction from the building. So you want these large wind plants, and most of the energy in New York in terms of wind is offshore. So it has to come eventually if we really want to do a conversion. In our plan, we have about 40% offshore wind. But obviously there are some barriers in terms of politics in getting it implemented.
Well, I'm going to just raise one phrase which came up a few years ago. It didn't originate with Tom Friedman, my friend at the Times, but he popularized it, which is the acronym BANANA, which is build absolutely nothing, built absolutely nothing anywhere near anything. It's like NIMBY on steroids. And when you look at the infrastructure that would be required to put in place the onshore wind, for example, and you realize how opposed people are to things like transmission lines, let alone natural gas pipelines, it raises the question of these social impediments to progress being significant in the long run. I did an article 15 years ago about when cell phone towers were becoming an issue. And I looked back through our New York Times clippings to 100 years ago when telephone poles were the issue. I mean, telegraph lines and poles, they were unsightly. And we just have this, and now we don't regard them with we don't look at them at all. So, but there is this issue, how do you kind of get around some of those impediments? I'll give you one other example, which is there are liberals and libertarians who hate smart meters that Karl mentioned before. The libertarians hate them because they're an intrusion on your life, and the liberals, some green liberals, hate them because they think they're irradiating their brains. So
they make tinfoil hats.
Oh, so they get it in Austin. They wear tinfoil hats to get around it. Okay. So I mean, but those are real issues. This is another arena where it'd be good to have someone focus on. Here's a picture of a clean energy future. Here's what we would need to do to get around some of those roadblocks as well. Isn't that's like another line of research or analysis, maybe?
The sociology of new technology adoption and sort of penetrating our views and stuff is important. There is good work going on in wind in particular. We can't overlook it. We get settled into our head. I once did a National Academy of Sciences study on wind impacts, and we went down to West Virginia, and a woman testified that she had worked all her life to retire, and now they were talking about putting wind turbines on the mountain ridge behind her house. And she said, I didn't retire, so I'd end up looking at wind turbines on the mountain ridge at my retirement home in West Virginia. And she was very vehement about it. And one of the local people mentioned to me that she had retired, in fact, from the coal company, and out of her front window she can see a mountaintop removal project going on. But she was real comfortable with that, because that's where the pension was coming from.
That's another interesting story.
Yeah, so we do have to work with people to understand what this stuff is and what it can do to you. I do think that the cost of the offshore wind thing is only going to come down if we build some more of them. There's still a lot of marine strengthening and durability technology that has to be done to make them really work well, but the Europeans have already been off and running. And but I do think it's the political opposition that looms pretty large. Look how long they've been fighting Cape Wind, and people you would even put on the liberal side. Teddy Kennedy at one point was in opposition to the Cape Wind project. Yeah.
So anyway, Mark, to me again, one of the most valuable parts of your work has been to provide a baseline, sort of a place where you can state by state say, okay, this is what it would look like. This is what we would need sociologically, financially, administratively, legally to make that happen. So it's a great prod for the other questions.
Well, the nice thing about wind that we found, we actually did a lot of research analysis and provided numbers about how much wind is available, and that actually is a big step if you really want to look at this on a large scale. Because really, if you do, I think, if you look throughout the U.S. and in each state, ideally the most efficient system is one that's, you have a plan for it, and then you say, this is where we're going to put all the wind, this is where we're going to put all the solar, then have competitive bidding for it, this is where we're going to put transmission. So everything's planned ahead of time. You make everything much more efficient. Currently, what's going on is we have piecemeal growth. There's one plant put up here, one wind farm, one solar farm put up here, transmission put up here and there. But you really, to organize this, you need a central kind of planning of it, either at the state level or country level. You can make the whole thing a lot more efficient, but there are a lot of barriers to doing that.
Okay, well, this is a start. So next question here in the audience. Say who you are, Ken.
Hi, my name is Mark Dunley, and I'm with the Green Education and Legal Fund. And we actually been meeting recently with the governor's office and the state legislators about implementing how to get to 100% clean energy by 2030, which is what was in the first report. The second report, where all 50 states talked about going to 2050, we had heard there was an issue of transportation. But it's a two-part question. One, is a 2030 goal still really feasible in New York State? And then the second part, we are trying to do a lot of outreach to labor unions, and obviously the job creation is a very attractive issue to the labor unions. But the first report talked about 4.5 million jobs being created, and the Solutions Project website talks about 500,000. Still a big number, but still different between 5 million and 500,000. Could you maybe explain the difference between those two numbers?
Okay, let me clarify. So actually in all our plans, in terms of the timeline, back to the 2009 Scientific American, it's actually been consistent, except there's been fine print that has not been very clear. We've always said that it's technically and economically feasible to do a conversion by 2030, but due to social and political reasons, it's unlikely to happen until 2050. So we stressed the technical and economics timeline in like the first papers, and I think even including in maybe New York paper. But in all the papers, it's always, we've said the same thing. But so we're kind of more towards the second, where we thought, well, let's just be more realistic about it now. We'll try to get 80 to 85% by 2030 as a practical goal, and 100% by 2050. So that's always been it. But it's we still think it's technically and economically feasible to do a conversion by 2030. Now, with regard to the, sorry, remind me, the second issue was the
jobs, 4.5 million versus 5,000 jobs.
Yeah, I don't have the numbers in front of me, but if I recall, one of the numbers was, it's just how it wasn't, like the new number is 40-year jobs, whereas I think the old number is something like, it was, so the 500,000, if that's the number, I think are 40-year construction plus operation jobs, permanent operation jobs. So it's like if one person were working for 40 years doing construction, as opposed to previously, it was jobs that were defined based on finishing a specific job for like a specific wind farm or solar farm that might be like a 1.5-year job. So the definition of jobs is what changed. One was the new one is a 40-year job. The previous one was like an actual physically finishing a single project job.
Thank you.
Or the economic analyses get pretty complicated and fuzzy. You just think about the jobs debates over Keystone Pipeline. It's hard. It's hard to get basic bedrock kind of answer.
Good morning. My name is Ellen Weininger. I'm with a science-based environmental health nonprofit. I have a question and just wanted to make a correction here. The waste-to-energy facilities are incinerators that are heavy emitters of climate changing and heavily polluting. In fact, we have one right here in Westchester County, the Moderator, which is a Title V facility emitting hundreds of thousands of tons of pollutants and greenhouse gases per year. And also with reference to the smart meters, it's a nonpartisan issue, and I would refer you to the American Academy of Environmental Medicine, the scientific literature that is emerging there, the BioInitiative report, and there's countless other studies and a mountain of peer-reviewed literature. The smart meters and digital utility meters pose a fire hazard and a health hazard. But now for my question for Mark. Hi, Mark. And just wanted to ask you, in terms of the angle of energy efficiency, we're seeing that a lot of energy efficiency consultants are in the process of doing their energy audits, are recommending conversions, perhaps a boiler that may be existing in an apartment building or a school or a residential setting, from an oil burner to a gas boiler. And wanted to ask you, in this moment in time right now, given all of the readily available cost-effective renewable energy options and solutions that you talk about, what would you recommend for someone who either has a piece of equipment that is not aged but can still work now, but they want to change the fuel or the method that it's using, or for someone who is on the brink of a piece of equipment breaking down and now is in a position to change? What would you recommend?
Well, for heating and cooling, heat pumps for sure. So these can be, heat pumps run on electricity, and they can be used, they extract heat out of either the air or the ground. And in New York, you probably want to take it out of the ground for most stability, or out of water, and they can run in reverse for air conditioning. So they're extremely efficient. They're better than electric resistance heating. The alternative would be an electric resistance heater, but that's less efficient than a heat pump. And so, I converted my home at 2005 to heat pumps for both for the air heating, and you can also do it for water heating. And it's so much more efficient. And so that's what I would recommend. Now, if you want to design a new community for heating and cooling, there's a community in Canada called Drake Landing that's been operating for about 7 years. It's a bunch of homes where they put, and this is in Alberta, where it gets really cold in the winter, and in the summer they collect heat through solar collectors on the roof. They send it down into the soil, the heat to the soil. They store its soil's insulated. They store the heat till winter, and then they run the system in reverse to heat the homes. 90% of the heating in the homes in the winter, when it's snowing, is from heat stored during the summer. That's called seasonal heat storage. It's really cheap. I mean, the actual soil is really cheap. You just have to insulate it. The collectors, they're just like solar collectors that you'd have for hot water, basically. So that's, if you want to build a community from scratch, that's what I would suggest, to integrate seasonal heat storage, and you can even be a lot off the grid. That's really distributed energy as well. But for cities, I mean, heat pumps are the most efficient thing that you could do to transition. Now, if you have an existing boiler, they have to burn something. I don't know. I mean, we want to phase out burning as much as possible. So I'd try to maybe we need some subsidies or something to get people off the boilers altogether and get them to heat pumps.
Yeah, my 1868 house in Hudson Valley unfortunately has a boiler run on oil still. So we just bought this house in August. My challenge is to cut the oil use in half while we're figuring out what to do next. So we all have our questions and challenges. These are good ones. We have more questions here at the mic.
Yeah, thank you again. And by the way, my note says it's non-ionizing radiation class 2B carcinogen. So I just wanted to be more specific. Thank you.
Actually, hold on one second, the mic. I do want to get in one I've been waiting to ask from Alan Nogi. He was the Union of Concerned Scientists Clean Energy Director for years. He's a very active person on Twitter. I'm sure he's
Yes.
Anyway, he asks a question. He says, Jacobson plan, this isn't kind of Twitter speak, so it's a little, I'll try to unpeel it. Jacobson plan, 80 to 100% renewable energy, means renewable energy capacity will end up being 1, 2, or 3 times peak demand. And peak demand is where, at least so far, renewables have had their place in the market. He says, how can such investments be economic on the margin, so far on the margin? I don't know if this is maybe more of a Karl question, but obviously for Mark too.
Well, Mark, will you take a shot?
Yeah, I'll take a shot first, and then you can pipe in. Yeah, so we did, as I mentioned earlier, we did this analysis that hasn't been even submitted for publication or even published yet, so it's hard for people to really judge it. But from this analysis, we looked at all our generators for our 50 state plans. We put them into put all the wind turbines, in fact, in the model. There are about 500,000 wind turbines to power half the U.S. and all the solar panels. We counted for competition among the wind turbines. We sized them. We sized the solar. We sized geothermal, hydro, everything else. Then we sized storage. We looked at the costs, and we found that the total net cost of energy, the levelized cost of energy, not necessarily the price people pay, because this is the cost of the energy, is between, in 2050, with storage, with demand response, with transmission, is 10 to 11 cents per kilowatt hour. And we looked at the fossil fuel cost at that time, it would be about 12 cents a kilowatt hour. And so with everything, and this is making a 100% reliable grid, we think we can have a low cost, and this is not a unique solution. There are many options we found that worked. we can have a low-cost, reliable grid, and so the actual installation numbers don't matter. Really depends on the cost of energy. That's so. Yeah, we don't. So I can give you the actual. I can give this the actual numbers of the installed megawatts of everything, or actually in this case terawatts. But when you actually look at the levelized cost, it was very cost competitive, and that's matching everything minute by minute. We actually did a 30-second time scale for 6 years. So I think we'd be fine actually in the future.
I'll just add a couple things. What Alan's getting to is the idea that if you just total up the number of hours during the year that a solar panel is generating electricity versus the number of hours in the year that there are, right? It ends up being that you'll get about 1,300 hours of electricity, and there's 8,760 hours a year. And that, in utility speak, that turns into a capacity factor that is about 12 or 13% roughly, okay? Maybe a little bit more, depending on where you are. And when we use our electricity, we tend to peak in our consumption, let's say summertime. We peak in our consumption around 4 p.m., 5 p.m., sometimes even later. And so solar's not operating then, so you need or not operating as well then. So the idea would be under conventional utility planning is that you'd have to build a lot more solar than you actually need because that peak is at 4 or 5 p.m. and solar peaks back at noon. First thing is we got to get out of our heads, and Alan knows this too, is assuming that that peak can't be managed, right? Remember, because when we gave him that electric vehicle, we allowed him to fill it up at noon and then use the electricity later on for the party. So that's one way we can start addressing this. We're not bound by the limitations of our technologies used in isolation. We have to approach this with a systems perspective. And we have to couple electric storage with electric intermittent renewable generation and grid management. Also turn that air conditioner down, at 4 p.m. maybe a little bit, and put all of them together in order to solve this problem. So step number one is solve this as a system problem. And then the other thing I'll say real quickly is that a lot of electricity analysis uses, this is a geeky term, the weighted average cost of capital of the utility in order to judge the value of future investments. What it means is that we use a discount rate on the future that could be as high as like 8%. And as somebody once said, and I like to repeat, on a discounted cash flow basis, the world isn't worth saving. Okay, it's not. The world has no future value because you take a discount rate out far enough, and you will get to zero value or really damn close to it. So we need to sort of break free of that kind of financial analysis limitation and assign appropriate discount rates when we're considering really big stuff like getting this world off of fossil fuels by 2050.
That is very tweetable, but I couldn't catch up with your what you said. Hopefully someone else did. So next question, let's say who you are.
My name is Larry Dridwell, and I'm on the faculty of the Lumen School of Business. And I would like to continue on the public policy dimensions. And the path that I would like to pursue with Karl is you mentioned what had happened in Austin. And you did call it a blueberry in this bowl of tomatoes. But it is nonetheless the capital of the great state of Texas, and you would think there might be some communication between what's going on in Austin as a municipality and what's going on at the state level. And so if all of these great achievements have occurred in Austin, why not the rest of the state of Texas? And then I'd also like you to address what do you see as the role of the federal government in terms of getting the public policy dynamics to move forward?
Yeah, wow. There's a whole lot to unpack in that. Let's just say that power lies in communities, and it is more powerful when you actually know the people you're talking to and you can engage with them. It dissipates, the power of the individual dissipates with the scale of the organization, oftentimes, and we're not real good at maintaining individual empowerment when we get bigger. It's why I was lamenting my concern about Austin in that 1 million person level. So Austin is a success story about a community. There are other communities. Denton in Fort Worth, near Fort Worth, is committed to getting real low on carbon and using the tools available and engaging the city and city officials. And that story is being replicated in a whole bunch of places. So I've come to the conclusion that it's a community level focus where it happens. And it is happening, but when it gets up, when they come to Austin, they're not at home, and they sometimes get more ideological than local. It's what can I say? It's also money talks. I mean, politics is money, So, but it's not. I'm picking the one community because I like what they did, but there's other places that are championing some real stuff.
There are a couple more questions here in the room. Just
The role of the federal government.
The role of the
I'm
federal
sorry.
government.
Yeah. I really like the direction the federal government is taking with things like the Clean Power Plan, right? The Section 111D under the Clean Air Act, the regulation of the existing power plant, in the sense that they are encouraging flexibility, and for the first time they're acknowledging that things like renewable energy, energy efficiency, and state-driven planning efforts can be tailored to the jurisdiction. I am aware that there are states where they're just thumbing their nose and planning to sue the feds, and some people would like a sort of more draconian limit imposed. But this is a cooperative federalism model of environmental protection we have, after all. And so I see some promise in that. And there's a hammer out there, maybe not on the time scale we'd all like, but at least we're making progress. And I know there's reasons to unlike a lot of these things.
A couple more questions?
So hopefully my question will follow on the last question. I am Carol D'Angelo. I'm a sister charity of New York. And I also am part of many other groups. One is religious organizations along the river. And many of my lay colleagues that are what we call ourselves very interested citizens who are trying to put forth a safe, renewable vision for a safe, renewable, clean energy policy. So my question is, some background. First of all, Mark, I have to say thank you because you probably remember, was it up in Mount Kisco where we had that tremendous turnout where you were Skyped in about your research, and we had a couple of hundred people in this room. And at that time, we were told how difficult it was for the team to get on the governor's agenda. So I was very happy to hear, Mark, that apparently there are some conversations going on with New York State. And I don't know at what level, but around your plan. Because when some of us were at one of the public hearings on the Reforming Your Energy Vision, when I was personally speaking ahead of time to one of the people on the commission, she said, oh yes, she wasn't that familiar with the plan, but at some of the public hearings, some people brought it up. So I did email her references to your plan. But my question is really, how might we, who are people who really feel that we need to put forth a vision and also help change or formulate new policy at this local level, how might we help out? What might we do? Because we have so many groups in our area that are working towards this. And so the other, I guess, piece of information, I'm assuming that the Atlantic chapter that has a special energy conference call, and they are trying to put forth how we might have, what is it, low carbon or carbon-free, fossil fuel-free future. I'm presuming, I haven't been on that call, I've just been talking to some of the people who are, I'm presuming they're talking about your plan. So I guess just update me and maybe Andy and Karl, you have some information in terms of here in New York State. We are already doing so much. We have to both activate against certain things that are happening that we feel are not good, but we have to keep on putting forth this vision. So this is why this is great, what we're doing today, because you're educating and increasing awareness. But we want to bring it back to more people and kind of mobilize ourselves to keep on doing this. So if you can give any information, Mark, about where New York State is now and what we can do. There are a lot of groups here I know that would take up this.
Yeah.
My question.
Well, thank you so much for your support of these energy plans. Well, I always say there are two steps. I mean, each individual, of course, can do a lot on their own in terms of their own homes or in their habits, and in terms of energy efficiency and improving, reducing energy use or getting more energy efficient appliances, and all their purchases of new, like vehicles, go to electric cars, putting as much solar on their roof, weatherizing their home, going to heat pumps, more efficient appliances, LED light bulbs. So a lot of people can do individual things. Collectively, if you have enough people in New York doing that, that's going to help. Okay, but then on the real thing, on the policy, to try to get the policymakers together, yeah, I mean, that's not really my world, but I could say that all the groups that are very proactive, it might be worth speaking with one voice, trying to coordinate with each other, because there are so many groups I'm aware of that in New York, as you mentioned, that they've been anti-fracking groups, but when they're anti-fracking, for example, they want to have some alternative, and this is a convenient alternative. So I think that is something to rally around if that's what is of interest to a lot of groups, and I think it probably is. How to effectively communicate all this to the governor. I mean, we've had in the past, actually, we did have, like 2 years ago, we had a lot of communication with the governor's office, and we'd proposed 5 first steps, short-term first steps to implement these plans. And he actually, in his State of the State address in 2013, Governor Cuomo implemented 3 of our suggestions, or at least he promised 3 of our suggestions, although he picked the numbers. These were the solar rooftops. He put, I think it was $1 billion or $1.5 billion into solar rooftops, $1 billion or $1.5 billion into green banks, and thousands of charging stations around the state. I mean, these seemed like basic things, but these were things that we'd proposed specifically for his office, among others. And so that was a step forward, but we haven't had a lot of interaction since, although I think we're still working. I personally haven't had much interaction. I think Mark Ruffalo has had maybe just more interaction, and I know another person in our group, Josh Fox, has been working through grassroots campaigns. So actually, that would be one way. In fact, Josh has a Solutions Project grassroots campaign in New York, really to raise awareness and to bring people together on the subject. So that might be one focal point, because Josh is part of the Solutions Project. He's a founder of the Solutions Project, and is a credible filmmaker, but also activist, and is really focusing a lot of attention on these clean, renewable solutions. And so maybe I would suggest to contact him and see how you can coordinate with him in terms of in New York.
Just so you know, this is Josh Fox, who created the film Gasland about fracking. And I think he recognized, and I wrote one aspect of that film. It's about what not to do. But as you were saying, how do you develop a new activism for creating a vision? It's a lot easier to be active and say no fracking, no solar, no wind, for those who are fighting wind power. And then it is to say how, yes.
Yeah. This vision is nothing more than the American dream, right? That we want a future generation's opportunities to be better and their world to be better. It's gotten lost these days with this weird kind of, everybody pays for it but me kind of thing that gets promoted on a whole lot of, or at least one in particular news channel, so-called news channel that will remain nameless. So if we don't buy into the Fox News version of the world, where nothing, we can have everything, but as long as I don't have to pay for it, and we instead think of this as a community activity, I think there's never been a more critical time for keeping the vision front and center. And we did this amazing set of things all across Texas in the early 2000 area, or deliberative polls, where we actually asked people, what do you want? And overwhelmingly they said, we want to advance energy efficiency, use the savings to advance renewable energy, and stop subsidizing the stuff that's already commercial, natural gas, coal, and give up on nuke. I mean, their views were very logical, but you do have to remind them. But one of the critical issues, I'll tell you, especially for faith communities, is that there's a split in faith communities. Also split in communities of color, where the short-term economic concerns are so dramatic that coming to those communities with "you must invest" now is just one more thing out of an already strained pocketbook. And we need to have that discussion. Green and everybody else, needs to sit down and say, okay, how are we going to invest in this future thing, and where did the investment come from? What way does it make sense so that we can get past that divide? Because that divide is being used against us, right? And in all sorts of communities. One last thing, real quick, I want to point you to. Look for a short little wonderful piece by Frank Ackerman called Climate Economics in 4 Easy Pieces. You don't have to be an economist to read it. It's very, very, very good and basic. And if you're going to have discussions about the future, it's exactly what we need to think about. I will close this comment on saying, this is the time when, like, the New York Commission and everybody else is going to get into the weeds and the details of this REV. And this is the time when they're most likely to forget the vision that underlies it. And there needs to be voices to continue. Like I said, this is the most important time to remind us of the vision that we're supposed to be keeping our sights on.
I'll tweet that link to that paper in a second.
Yeah.
There's another question at the microphone.
Great, thank you. I'm Nina Orville, and I'm the program manager for Solarize Westchester, which is a project that's all about saying yes. And it offers the opportunity for local communities to get involved, and hopefully for some people from the university community to get involved as well through research or internships.
And Nina's a lot more than just the program director. If you don't know who she is, you should. I don't know how she does all the different things she's doing for sustainability in Westchester and in New York. So
thank you, Karl. I appreciate it. So Solarize Westchester, just really briefly, it is focused on dramatically increasing the amount of rooftop solar in Westchester County, and to take the lessons learned from that and to share them elsewhere in New York State as well. We're working with all the municipalities in the county on encouraging them to adopt solar-friendly permitting and zoning practices. That's something that we're doing with Pace Law School as well. And there's another component, which is a market aggregation effort, or Solarize campaigns, which we're rolling out in select communities around Westchester County. There are 4 campaigns underway now, and we're going to be selecting communities for the second round of these campaigns starting in June. So I encourage everybody who might be interested to have your community get involved to look at the solarizewestchester.com website. And it's all about identifying and eliminating the barriers that exist to people making the decision to install solar. So it eliminates the inertia barrier by having a deadline, the affordability barrier with low negotiated prices and great financing options. The trust issue, because there's strong municipal support and support from New York State. The complexity issue, because there's one installer who's vetted and selected for each campaign. And we're getting very good results in the beginning of these first round of campaigns. We're looking to get a minimum of 400 installations in Westchester County through these limited number of communities participating, and looking to roll it out across the county and beyond. So I just encourage anyone interested to get in touch with me, because I would love to work with you on it.
What's the website for Solarize Westchester?
It's solarizewestchester.com.
Okay, so that makes it easy.
Yes.
Someone should tweet that too.
we're buying a house, so I'm working on my wife. Right?
Okay, excellent.
I
Talk to me, Karl.
Yes.
So, by the way, Mark, this still leads me back to the opportunity, whether it's from the academic community or elsewhere, to build on your 50-state map, a layer that's about the impediments and opportunities state by state to having this shift in the energy landscape. I think whether it doesn't have to be literally on your map on your website, but it would be if you built a baseline that people can then build on new layers of meaning.
Yeah, well, definitely there are impediments state by state, and so this, I think in the solutions project, that would be where we would try to focus on peeling back those impediments and identifying them and the barriers. Yeah, so as I mentioned, I mean, we think of this as like we're doing the science, but there's also the engagement of the public and the engagement of business, and actually bringing businesses on board as well to reduce the impediments. I mean, that's one thing we haven't really touched upon in this talk, is how do we get businesses involved, because they actually have their own self-interest to go to renewable energy because it's to make themselves more sustainable and lower costs in the long run. And there are a lot of big companies that are really engaged. And I'll just point to one example. Take Walmart. Walmart actually, at some point, I don't know if they still have this goal, but they had a goal to go to 100% renewable energy in their own company, so they were interested in our plans. We also did a study looking at the impacts of large arrays of offshore wind turbines on reducing hurricane risk, because the turbines, if you can keep them on during a hurricane, and especially in the East Coast where the wind speeds don't get so fast in a hurricane to destroy the turbines, you can actually extract, if you have large numbers of these turbines, you can actually extract some energy from the hurricane, reducing their impacts. And actually, Walmart was very interested in this because they lose stores along the coast due to hurricanes, and so they were interested both from the renewable energy point of view and the hurricane reduction point of view. But if you can get businesses involved, that's one way to affect policy, because the governor of a state is going to listen a lot more if you can bring some huge businesses to the table and to invest in the state. Let's say if there are big buildings in New York City that, let's say Google or Facebook want to power with renewable energy, and if they can guarantee they'll get that energy from some clean source, that would be an investment in the state that the governor would like. So that's one way to reduce impediments, is to engage businesses in addition to engaging the public through the grassroots efforts.
Did you have a question?
I'm sorry, let me just add one more thing real quick. This is Larry was mentioning the federal government. This is another area where the federal government has been really helpful. They have this fantastic Sunshot Initiative. I say that because at the Energy and Climate Center, we're a recipient of a grant to advance regional cooperation on solar policy to address some of these very same things. Trying to harmonize the markets in the 9-state Northeast region. Because right now, a solar installer, if he drives 20 miles from here, or she wants to do a work 20 miles from here, she can be in another state in a whole new market. So harmonizing these issues and addressing these so-called soft costs is really valuable. The Department of Energy has been great about that. At the center, we've also received funding for over a dozen years on combined heat and power, distributed energy systems, to advance that in the region as well. So that's a really valuable role for the federal government, to advance regional issues and targeted nationwide issues like these implementation issues of scale and soft costs.
Okay, there's one more question in the microphone, and we're coming toward a close. It's hard to sustain interest and energy in a 2-hour conversation on energy, but we've done it.
Hi, I'm Glenn Weinberg from Queens College. My question is for Karl. You alluded to it a little bit, but maybe you could talk a little bit more about the community energy model, especially like the New York Prize competition that is just starting now. Community microgrids, including combined heat and power, as you just mentioned, and shared solar and things like that.
So I started at the very start. It's one alternative to this top-down central station power plant model is to take advantage of things locally. It's very challenging to do it at the individual household level, right? Because we're all very different. And so one step in between that really is taking off is community empowerment. Putting together a lot of solar panels in one installation, perhaps big enough for 10, 20, 200 customers to participate in solar. Use that same grid infrastructure that's already there, but instead of having to put it on their roof, basically they're getting it from across the street or at a parking lot, a covered parking lot at the metro station or something like that. So these community or shared solar projects are ways for people who live in rental places or who don't have suitable roofs or have big trees to participate in solar. Another idea, a step further from that, is to integrate that kind of community scale generation into a microgrid, which is basically a subset of the grid that is managed for that reliability that we need, that includes that energy management, includes those trade-offs between customers, when do you need it kind of things, and can solve the problems there. And then one step even further that's being considered, especially like around Ulster County Citizens for Local Power is exploring this real aggressively. Westchester is doing a little bit of this, is community choice aggregation, where communities get together and say, we want to be customers for clean energy. We want to participate as a community, as a county, in managing our energy destiny. And all of this is potentially being enabled by this REV proceeding that's going on in Albany and everywhere.
Question here, and we're close to.
Yeah, but before I get to my question, quick comment. By the way, I didn't introduce myself earlier. My name is Pramila Malik, and I'm a community organizer. Karl, so the microgrids, given the low cost of natural gas right now, there would be nothing preventing a community from choosing natural gas as a microgrid generation source, right?
Well, no, I should say that you shouldn't automatically assume that, because you do get air pollution from combusting things, and you might not, you'll have local NOx, emissions and ozone creation from combustion of natural gas, and it might be very hard to cite at least an inefficient natural gas engine. But you're right, there is an economic pressure that might have people going, yeah, we'll just skip that expensive solar stuff, we're going to do some of that cheap natural gas. So that is a concern. And regulators, county officials, citizens all have a role to play in shaping what the choices are made. But it's a risk.
They can have strong renewable energy requirements or standards.
Exactly.
But back to the REV for 1 second. My question is this. You had kind of started out your talk by presenting it as a kind of invoking free market principles and breaking up or weakening the monopolies of utilities. But from what I understand, part of the REV is the implementation of the distributed energy resources platform, providers platform, and in the track 1 proceedings, I think it advocates that the platform would be under the control of the major utilities. So it's actually taking something which is already underway right now, which is distributed energy resources, and putting them in the control of utilities. And I'm a little concerned about that. And also, it is...
Let me pause you real quick. You're not alone. That is one of the major design concerns with REV. The thesis is that these utilities will now become platform providers, that they won't actually own much of these distributed resources. We're only in limited cases, and that we're trying to bring in third parties to provide these services. But there are a lot of people worried that it's the fox in charge of the hen house kind of concern. The commission's aware of it. Some people have proposed, let's just do something preventative now and don't let them anywhere near it. Some people said, well, they can be watched. We're going to have to work through this. You're exactly right that this is a tough issue, and the good news is that everybody's paying attention to it. Will we get it exactly right? I don't have that good a crystal ball,
Well, when I'm done with my question, I'm interested to know what Professor Jacobson's thoughts are on the utilities having control over the platform. But the other question I wanted to ask you is that the REV is proposing deregulation of the retail market. And when the wholesale market was deregulated in our state over a decade ago, that led to the largest price increases, I think, in the nation. New York still has, now has one of the largest electric rates in the country. And so how do we know that this is not going to end up happening now with the deregulation of the retail market?
That's a very good concern, right? Because there will be more people who want to make more profit coming into the business. One of the most important things we need to do is to remember that what customers pay is not rates but bills. So you can have slightly higher rates and have lower bills if somebody is partnering with you to reduce your consumption. The whole solar lease model is based on the idea that if you participate in a 20-year lease on a solar plant, you can save money from day one, even though because the lease for the solar is substituting. And they're still making a pretty good profit on that. It's even cheaper if you can afford to buy the solar yourself. But my point is, we should manage against bills. $100 a month, if that's what you're spending on electricity, if you're lucky enough to only spend $100 a month, it should not go up. But the rate per unit of electricity, in the end, shouldn't matter to you if you're being helped to use less. So that's what we want to try to accomplish. And finally, we'll say, there is no way around the idea that investments cost some money. We're going to have to make some investments in this platform and try to do it informed by this analysis of the long-term benefits, as Mark has been saying, the levelized cost of energy, to realize that the solar resources, wind resources, you pay for all your fuel up front. And you don't get to pay as you go like you do with a gas plant or a coal plant, or let the future pay the climate costs of that. So I can't sugarcoat it for you. There are some challenges.
Professor Jacobson, do you have some thoughts on the REV? Have you looked at it and the control of the utilities of the platform?
I just want to chime in. We've got 2 minutes left.
Yeah.
Okay, I'll say really fast that it looked like it's a interesting opportunity because you really want to engage distributed energy as much chance as you want to the degree you can, and it seems like it's probably a good idea not to allow utilities to monopolize the distributed energy as well. So I haven't looked at a lot of details, not nearly as much as Karl. So I'll just defer to him for better evaluation of that.
Okay, quickly.
Actually, that pay-as-you-go would work with that garbage stuff. If people had to pay, you'd see a lot less garbage, a lot more recycling and reduction of use. Mark, just wanted to see if you could expand a little bit about in your work, your research, and your recent studies about the actual external costs, pollution costs, morbidity, healthcare costs. I know that that's part of the picture that often gets lost. So, thank you.
Well, we actually went state by state to look at from air quality monitoring stations, and we did calculation based on epidemiological data of what are the mortalities in each state. And we found over the entire U.S. it's about 63,000 people per year die prematurely from air pollution today. And we did actually an evaluation based on future technologies, what that would change to in 2050, and it was a business as usual case, and we still find about 45,000, 46,000 deaths per year in the U.S. And that costs the U.S. on the order of 3.3% or so of the GDP. If you look at the statistical cost of life and of morbidity as well. So that's a huge cost just from the air pollution alone. And then in terms of climate, and that's on the order of $500 to $600 billion per year in 2050 for air pollution costs. And in terms of cents per kilowatt hour, it's equivalent to about 5 cents per kilowatt hour, actually 5 to 5.7 in 2050. Compared to the average cost of electricity in the United States is about 13 cents a kilowatt hour. In New York, I think it's around 18. And so that's on top of that is another 5 cents a kilowatt hour of health. Sorry, that 5 cents is health plus climate costs. So when we're looking at the real cost of energy, we have to consider both the health and climate costs as well as the direct cost of energy. And so that's another reason why going to this wind, water, solar will be a cheaper solution in the future.
Great. We have one more question. Hopefully, brief one.
Wonderful. Very quickly, Mr. Rábago and Karl, can you comment on the President's Climate Action Plan in reference to the fact that it regularly refers to natural gas as a renewable fuel? And if we all know here that natural gas is strong, even though it burns clean, it's a strong contributor to climate change. Carbon dioxide Can you refer to that?
I think the characterization is it is as a clean fuel, and I think it would be more accurate to call it cleaner. You can have renewable natural gas, as we talked about, in essence, if you think about it in terms of short cycles from biological materials. But the natural gas we're talking about now, it's a mistake to call it renewable. It's a mistake to mislead people into thinking that fossil-aged fuel brought up from the ground is renewable, because none of us are going to have that timeline. We can't even envision the timeline to renew that natural gas. But there is, there is a meme out there that treats it as cleaner, and because it is cleaner compared to coal. And
that's debatable.
Well, I know, and there's good debates. We should have a discussion. Like I said, there's a lot of people thinking of it as a bridge fuel because of its low economic cost while we invest in renewables. My take is this is what we should do. We should just simply have one simple rule. If I were the king of the world, it'd be every time you want a new megawatt of natural gas, you must retire a megawatt of something dirtier like coal, and you must invest in a megawatt of something cleaner like renewables and efficiency. And if that's the price of your new megawatt of gas, I think we could sort of accelerate the transition a lot better. We're getting some of the first two, because the new prices of gas are causing coal retirements in a lot of different places. Not as fast as I think we need them, but we're not getting the simultaneous. We're deferring the investment in the clean energy of the future in some cases, and we need to accelerate that. So that would be my proposal.
That's a really good New York Times op-ed idea. So we'll talk about that afterwards. Thank you all, both in the room and online, for listening. The YouTube video will go live and be an archived YouTube video as of now. So anyone who's interested in these issues, please pass it forward to your friends, put it on Facebook. And thanks to everyone at the Pace Academy for Applied Environmental Studies and its partners in organizing this event. Carolyn Craig, particularly, is standing at the podium. Come before the camera here quickly. Who facilitated the technology, Donna Cole in the back of the room, and onward. And keep that Energy Pace hashtag on Twitter. There'll be an ongoing discussion there as well. Thank you all, and thank you, Karl. Thank you, Mark.
Thank you.
Thank you, Andy. Thanks, Karl.